Almost everyone who bought into the biggest IPO in the history of the stock market thought they were buying a rocket company. In June of 2026, SpaceX hit the Nasdaq, worth about $2 trillion. Bigger than Saudi Aramco, bigger than anything ever. And everyone assumed they were buying rockets. They weren't. Because buried in the prospectus, the document a company files before it goes public, was a number that told a completely different story. SpaceX told Wall Street the total market it could someday sell into was $28.5 trillion. That's not a typo. It's a market nearly the size of the entire US economy. And roughly 90% of it wasn't rockets. It wasn't satellites. It was artificial intelligence. One legendary valuation expert read it and joked that the filing looked like it had been written by Grok. He wasn't entirely wrong, because in the span of a few months, the most important rocket company on Earth had quietly done something nobody quite registered. It bought an AI company. And then it went public to raise the money to build data centers in space. The rocket company had become an AI company. And here's the wild part. Back in March of 2026, this exact plan sounded like pure science fiction. We made a whole video on it, and plenty of people laughed. A few months later, it was the largest IPO in history. That's how fast this is moving. So let's do the thing almost no one has done properly. Follow the money. How SpaceX actually makes it. Why a rocket company bought an AI lab. What it's really trying to build up there. And the honest, hard question underneath all of it. Can this possibly work? Because there's a pattern with Elon Musk. They tell him something is impossible, and then he does it anyway. Before we get to the satellites in space, you need 60 seconds on the machine that pays for all of it. Because once you see how SpaceX actually makes money, the space bet stops looking insane and starts looking inevitable. SpaceX is really three businesses stacked on top of each other. A flywheel where each one feeds the next. Start with the one everybody knows, launch. In 2025, SpaceX flew 165 rockets, a record, and put more than 80% of the entire world's cargo into orbit. Just SpaceX, more than every other company and every other country on the planet combined. And yet, on paper, launch barely breaks even. It's essentially a utility, a business that exists to do one thing: guarantee cheap, reliable access to space. Whatever thin profit it makes gets poured straight back into building Starship. The business that actually makes the money is Starlink, the Internet from Space network. And this one is a genuine cash machine. In 2025, Starlink brought in over $11 billion, serving more than 12 million customers across 160 countries. And it keeps more than 60 cents of every dollar as profit, a margin most companies can only dream of. That is the profit engine, the part of SpaceX that quietly turned into one of the best businesses in tech, while everyone was watching the rockets. Now, here's the part that trips people up. If Starlink makes that much money, is SpaceX wildly profitable? No. The company as a whole invests more than it earns, because every dollar Starlink generates gets fed forward, into Starship, and now into the AI bet. That's not a weakness, that's the strategy. It's a company that treats profit as fuel. And the real magic is the flywheel. SpaceX builds the rockets, it builds the satellites, it builds the terminals, the dishes on people's roofs. And then it becomes its own biggest customer. About 3/4 of those record-breaking launches in 2025 were just SpaceX launching its own Starlink satellites. That self-demand lets it fly its rockets over and over. One of its boosters has flown more than 35 separate missions, which drives the cost of space down, which makes Starlink cheaper to build, which funds more launches. Reuse, vertical integration, building every piece itself, and self-demand, all compounding. No competitor has all three. So that's the machine, a launch utility, a Starlink cash cow, and a whole company engineered to turn profit into the next impossible thing. And in early 2026, that machine did something no rocket company had ever done. It went out and bought an AI lab. On February 2nd, 2026, SpaceX absorbed xAI, Elon Musk's artificial intelligence company, the one that makes the Grok chatbot, along with the social platform X. It was an all-stock deal, the two companies valued together at about $1.25 trillion, the largest private merger ever done. and it was soon rebranded SpaceXAI, officially the AI division of SpaceX. Now, why would a rocket company buy an AI lab? Because the two problems turned out to be the same problem. Frontier AI is astonishingly expensive to run. XAI alone was spending on the order of $1 billion a month on computing power. Every serious AI company is now slamming into the same wall. To build a bigger model, you need a bigger data center. And a bigger data center needs staggering amounts of power, land, water, and cooling. And Earth is running out of easy places to put them. Most people look at that wall and try to negotiate a better electricity deal. Musk looked at it and asked a different question. The kind of first principles question that's his whole signature. If what AI really needs is unlimited, cheap, uninterrupted power, where is there unlimited, cheap, uninterrupted power? And the answer is in space, where the sun never sets. That's the logic of the merger. Suddenly one man owned the launch, the rockets, the network, Starlink, and the AI itself, Grok. The road, the on-ramps, and the cargo, all under one roof. Nobody in history has held all three at once. One quick caveat, because it matters. XAI's giant supercomputer, the one called Colossus down in Memphis, sits on the ground, here on Earth. The space part is a separate future bet, and that bet is what the IPO was really for. So what does a data center in space actually look like? In June 2026, SpaceX showed us. It's called AI-1. Picture a satellite with a 70-meter wingspan, wider than a jumbo jet, carrying about 150 kilowatts of computing power, roughly one rack of NVIDIA chips. It's cooled by huge liquid radiators, and it talks to its neighbors by laser. Musk's description was almost dismissive. It's much simpler than a Starlink satellite, essentially a lot of solar cells. And the scale of the ambition is hard to overstate. SpaceX has asked the FCC, the US agency that hands out the airwaves, for permission to launch up to 1 million of these satellites. Picture that, not one, but 1 million. A shell of computers wrapped around the planet, bathed in sunlight that never stops. It's building a factory in Bastrop, Texas, nicknamed Gigaset, to start cranking them out by the end of 2027. The roadmap ramps to 100 gigawatts of computing per year by 2030. Musk's line, space is the only way to scale AI. Why isn't this crazy? In orbit, the sun shines 24 hours a day. Free, constant power, no grid to connect to. There's no land to buy, no water to drink, no neighbors to object. And the new Starlink V3 satellites already carry the laser mesh, around a terabit per second between satellites, that could stitch an orbital cluster together. And here's the pressure that makes the whole bet make sense. Earth is starting to say no. In 2026, New York became the first state in the country to hit pause on giant new data centers. A 1-year moratorium on the biggest facilities, over exactly these worries: power bills, water, and angry neighbors. And more than 30 states have taken up similar measures. The ground is filling up with limits on power, on water, on political patience, which is precisely the constraint an orbital data center is designed to escape. We made a whole video on that backlash. It's linked in the description. And SpaceX isn't alone up there. A startup called StarCloud already flew a data center-grade NVIDIA chip into orbit and ran a real AI model on it. Google has its own space compute program. Blue Origin has filed too. In the space of about 90 days, data centers in space went from a punchline to a race. But, and this is the honest hinge of the whole story, not one of SpaceX's own compute satellites has flown. At this stage, it's a design and a filing. Which brings us to the real question everyone should be asking. Can it actually work? And to answer that fairly, remember the pattern. Reusable rockets were impossible until SpaceX landed one upright on a barge in the ocean. Catching a 20-story booster out of the sky with a pair of mechanical arms was absurd, until they did it, on video, in 2024. The whole company nearly went bankrupt in 2008. One failed launch from the end. And then it didn't. Starlink would never make money. It's now that $11 billion profit engine. So when the experts line up to explain why data centers in space can't work, it's at least worth asking who's been right so far. Now, the objections are real, and I'm not going to wave them away. Heat is the big one. In the vacuum of space, there's no air to carry warmth away. You can only radiate it. And the radiators get enormous. One engineering estimate says a single 40-kilowatt rack of chips would need a radiator about the size of a pickleball court. But notice what kind of problem that is. It's an engineering problem, not a law of physics. The AI-1 satellite already carries about 110 square meters of liquid radiators. And the same first principles team that taught rockets to land is now attacking heat rejection. Then there's cost. For now, computing in orbit runs several times more expensive than on the ground, and the entire business case rests on one number, the price of launch, which means it rests on Starship. But that number is exactly what Musk has spent 20 years driving into the floor. The space shuttle cost $54,000 a kilogram to reach orbit. Falcon 9 cut that to about $2,700 a kilo. Starship is targeting $10 to $20 a kilo. Google's analysts think orbital data centers pencil out around 2035. Musk says 2 to 3 years. And historically, on launch cost, the man with the rockets tends to beat the man with the spreadsheet. Yes, Starship is still being tested, and it hasn't nailed every landing along the way. But it'll never fly has aged badly every single time. Okay, the physics might bend, but what about the money people? They've got objections too, and they've been wrong about this exact man before. The famous valuation expert I mentioned, Ashwath Damodaran, thinks the company came public too expensive and calls that $28.5 trillion market bordering on fantasy. He might be right. But Wall Street said almost exactly that about Tesla and underpriced it for a decade. Analysts can only model the business in front of them, not the one a first principles builder is about to invent. And what about the ghost everyone brings up, Iridium, the 1990s satellite phone company that spent $5 billion, signed up 10,000 customers, and went bankrupt? It's a fair objection, and here's the answer. Iridium had no reusable rockets, no launch cost advantage, and no built-in demand. It had to invent a market from scratch. SpaceX has all three. Musk didn't ignore Iridium's ghost. He built the one company that fixes every reason it failed. So the real read isn't "this is impossible." It's the hardest infrastructure bet in tech, placed by the one person who owns the rockets, the network, the AI, and a 20-year record of doing exactly what everyone said couldn't be done. There's a rhyme for this in history. The last time a single company owned an entire industry, top to bottom, the wires, the switches, the factories that made the hardware, the labs that invented the future, it was the old American phone monopoly, AT&T. And out of that total vertical integration came Bell Labs, the transistor, the solar cell, the very theory of information. One of the most productive engines of invention the world has ever seen. Yes, it was eventually broken up, but the building era changed the world first. Owning the whole stack is a superpower long before it's a question. And what SpaceX is assembling is arguably even more complete. No company has ever owned the launch, a global network, a frontier AI lab, and the manufacturing to build 1 million satellites, all at the same time. And there's one more piece most people miss. Tesla, the company that solved mass manufacturing at planetary scale, that builds its own AI chips, rounds out the picture. Tesla's factories, xAI's models, SpaceX's rockets, Starlink's network, all pointed the same direction. If that integration compounds the way Bell's did, it's an advantage nobody can copy. Here's where we actually are. The first orbital data center is a 2027 event. The problems are real, the heat, the cost, the sheer audacity of it. But the direction is set, and the track record is not a rumor. The biggest bet of the AI era isn't a smarter chatbot, it's infrastructure. And the one builder with a record of turning impossible into ordinary just bet the entire $2 trillion company he took public on owning all of it. So the rocket company that promised us Mars may end up mattering even more for a reason we didn't see coming. It decided the future of intelligence would be built above our heads, and made itself the only company that could pour the foundation. If Musk is right, and betting against him has been a losing trade, then before this decade is out, the sky quietly fills with machines, and intelligence becomes something like sunlight, abundant, everywhere, and almost free. The race to build the infrastructure of the AI age just left the launch pad, and the smart money learned a long time ago not to bet against the man holding the rockets. If you think he pulls it off, or if you think this one finally burns up on re-entry, tell me in the comments. And that very first video, where this whole story started, it's right there on the end screen. Subscribe, and we'll keep watching this thing climb.